The Eternal Deliverer-Man. Rain pelted down in relentless waves over the dark city streets, bouncing off neon lights and pooling in the cracks of worn asphalt. Marcos tightened his jacket, shielding his phone from the deluge as he waited by his motorbike. His Uber Eats app buzzed with a new order. He sighed, staring at the screen. Delivery to 107 Sunset Avenue. The address was unfamiliar, unmarked on his mental map of the city. Still, a job was a job. The journey to Sunset Avenue was eerily quiet. The rain drowned out the usual hum of life, leaving only the muted growl of his engine. When he arrived, the address seemed wrong. Before him stood a grand but decaying mansion, its once pristine facade streaked with age and grime. Ivy climbed the walls, wrapping around broken windows like claws. No lights inside, no sign of life. Yet, the app insisted this was the place. He hesitated but knocked on the towering wooden door. It creaked open under his touch, revealing a warm glow emanating from within. The contrast was startling. Stepping inside, Marcos found himself in a lavish ballroom, chandeliers glittering above, and the floor alive with swirling couples dressed in elegant 1920s attire. A jazz band played softly in the corner, their music somehow reaching every corner of the grand space. The scent of perfume and cigar smoke mingled in the air. Marcos stood frozen, clutching the delivery bag. "What the?" he whispered, his words swallowed by the ambient noise. A sharply dressed waiter approached him, his footsteps eerily silent against the polished wood floor. "The kitchen is that way," he said, pointing to a door at the far end of the room. Marcos nodded numbly, his feet moving before his mind could catch up. As he walked, he noticed the eyes of the dancers following him, their gazes uncomfortably intense. The kitchen door swung open with ease, revealing not a kitchen but an empty corridor. The walls were damp, lit by flickering sconces that cast jagged shadows. A cold wind howled through the passage, chilling Marcos to his core. He turned to leave, but the door behind him had vanished, replaced by a solid brick wall. Marcos's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He moved forward, his steps echoing in the narrow space. At the end of the corridor, another door waited. With no other choice, he pushed it open and stepped into chaos. He was no longer in the mansion. Instead, he stood on a cobblestone street under a sky darkened by soot. The air smelled of smoke and metal, and the clanging of blacksmiths filled his ears. Men in chainmail and tunics rushed past him, shouting orders in a language he barely recognized. He looked down at his phone, dead. The delivery bag in his hand now seemed out of place, its bright logo a glaring anachronism. A figure approached him, a man with a crown perched upon his brow and a look of annoyance etched deeply into his face. "Are these the provisions for the feast?" he demanded, his voice a mix of authority and impatience. Marcos hesitated, fumbling with the bag. Sure," he stammered. The king snatched it from his hands and pulled out a box of tacos. He sniffed one cautiously before taking a bite. His eyes widened, and a smile spread across his face. "What is this ambrosia?" he exclaimed. Marcos had no time to answer before the ground beneath him began to quake. The sky above twisted, and the cobblestone street fractured, revealing flashes of neon and concrete beneath. Marcos blinked, and he was gone. He landed with a thud on a sleek, metallic surface. Bright lights assaulted his eyes, and the hum of machinery filled his ears. He was now in a sprawling cityscape, towers of glass and steel reaching toward a sky crowded with drones. He recognized the logo on one of the drones. It was the same as his delivery bag. Except now, the drones were autonomous, zipping through the air with robotic precision. A screen nearby lit up, displaying his name, delivery ID, Marcos Velasquez. Beneath it, The words human couriers obsolete blinked in bold letters. Marcos felt a knot of unease in his stomach. He was a relic in this world, out of place and out of time. As he wandered, a voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. Final delivery pending, address unknown. Marcos stood frozen on the metallic platform, his pulse racing as the disembodied voice echoed in the sterile air. Final delivery pending, address unknown. The words looped in his mind, each repetition heavier than the last. Around him, the city hummed with an eerie precision. Drones weaving between the towering skyscrapers, screens displaying advertisements in languages he couldn't recognize, and figures in sleek, metallic uniforms moving with machine-like efficiency. A nearby screen flickered, displaying his face alongside his delivery ID. Human courier detected, the robotic voice announced. Task overdue. Redirecting. The screen flashed again, showing a cryptic set of coordinates. Marcos clutched his delivery bag tighter, feeling like an intruder in a world that no longer needed him. He turned to leave the platform, but his legs felt heavy, almost as if the world itself was pulling him back. Redirecting, the voice repeated. A drone descended from above, scanning him with a cold, blue light. Courier Velasquez, Marcos. Assigned package status. Incomplete. Before Marcos could protest, the drone emitted a pulse of energy that enveloped him in a blinding white light. The metallic city dissolved around him, replaced by the unmistakable smell of salt water and the distant cries of seagulls. He blinked, adjusting to the sudden brightness of the sun overhead. The sound of waves crashing against rocks filled his ears, and when he looked around, he realized he was standing on the deck of a wooden ship. The ship creaked and swayed as if it had been plucked from a pirate movie set, but everything about it felt real. The worn planks under his boots, the salty breeze on his skin, and the crew bustling about, each detail vivid and disorienting. A man wearing a tricorn hat approached him, his expression a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "You there? What's in the bag?" he barked, gesturing toward Marcos's delivery bag. Marcos hesitated. Tacos," he replied, his voice uncertain. The crew erupted into laughter, their voices rough and mocking. "Tacos," he says, one of them shouted. "What's a taco?" another added, wiping a tear from his eye. The captain, however, wasn't amused. He snatched the bag from Marcos and inspected its contents. "Looks strange," he muttered, pulling out a taco and sniffing it cautiously. "But food's food." Before Marcos could explain or warn him, the captain took a large bite. His eyes widened, and he froze mid-chew. The crew fell silent, watching their leader as he swallowed the bite and licked his fingers. This is unlike anything I've tasted before," the captain declared. "Men, secure this man and his magic food. He stays aboard until we figure out where he got it." Marcos backed away, panic rising in his chest. He had no intention of being their captive or explaining the concept of fast food to a group of pirates. As the crew advanced, the ship lurched violently, sending barrels and crates tumbling across the deck. The sky above darkened unnaturally, swirling with colors that didn't belong. Marcos clung to the mast as a deafening roar filled the air. The ship seemed to tear apart at the seams, and the ocean below vanished, replaced by a vast expanse of white nothingness. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on a soft surface. The stark contrast to the chaos on the ship left him momentarily disoriented. He sat up, realizing he was in a room that seemed plucked from a futuristic dream. Sleek, white walls curved seamlessly into the floor and ceiling, and a faint hum vibrated through the space. A holographic display hovered in front of him, cycling through images of his previous deliveries. The grand ballroom, the medieval feast, the futuristic city, and the pirate ship. Final delivery, the hologram announced in a soothing tone. Recipient pending. Marcos stood, his heart pounding. He reached for his bag, which sat on a pedestal in the center of the room. It looked the same, but something about it felt different. The bag now glowed faintly, and when he opened it, the contents were unfamiliar. A single, steaming pizza sat inside, perfectly round, its aroma both enticing and otherworldly. A door materialized on one side of the room, sliding open with a soft hiss. Beyond it was a long, narrow hallway bathed in an ethereal blue light. The walls seemed alive, pulsing gently as if breathing. Marcos hesitated, but knew he had no choice. Clutching the bag tightly, he stepped into the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The hallway seemed endless, but eventually, it opened into a vast chamber. At its center stood a figure cloaked in shadows, their face obscured by a hood. The figure exuded an aura of authority, and though Marcos couldn't see their features, he felt their eyes on him. "You've traveled far," the figure said, their voice reverberating through the chamber. "You've crossed time and space, delivering sustenance to those who needed it. But this is your ultimate task." Marcos held up the bag. "I didn't choose this," he said, his voice trembling. "I just wanted to finish my shift." The figure chuckled softly. "Choice is an illusion, courier. You were chosen long before you took your first delivery. Now, complete your mission." Marcos approached cautiously, extending the bag. As the figure reached for it, the walls of the chamber began to shift and shimmer, revealing glimpses of the places he had visited. The ballroom, the medieval castle, the futuristic city, the pirate ship. Each image lingered for a moment before dissolving into the void. When the figure took the bag, the chamber filled with light so intense that Marcos had to shield his eyes. The ground beneath him vanished, and he felt himself falling. Marcos's fall seemed endless, his body weightless as he spiraled through a void of blinding light and kaleidoscopic colors. Time itself felt meaningless. Seconds stretched into eternities, and eternities compressed into heartbeats. Just as his mind threatened to surrender to the chaos, the sensation of solid ground beneath him jolted him back to reality. He opened his eyes to find himself standing in a desert, but it was no ordinary desert. The sand shimmered as if made of glass, reflecting a sky that defied logic. Above him, constellations twisted and reformed, dancing in patterns that seemed deliberate, purposeful. In the distance, structures loomed, massive pillars of stone etched with symbols that seemed to shift whenever he looked away. The delivery bag was still slung over his shoulder, but it felt heavier now, almost as if it were resisting him. He hesitated, scanning his surroundings, but there was no clear direction to go. The desert stretched infinitely in every direction, the pillars the only landmarks. And then he felt it, a pull, faint but undeniable, tugging him toward the nearest pillar. As Marcos approached, the air grew thick, heavy with an energy that seemed to hum just beyond the range of hearing. The pillar towered above him, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story. Scenes of people, timelines, and strange machines intertwined, forming a narrative that felt both familiar and alien. At the base of the pillar, a pedestal jutted out, and on it sat a single object, a perfectly ordinary pizza box. It was pristine, untouched by the sand or time. Marcos blinked, his mind struggling to process the absurdity of it all. He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against the box. The moment he touched it, the symbols on the pillar flared to life, glowing with a blinding intensity. The ground beneath him trembled, and a voice, not robotic, but ancient, resonant, spoke from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have carried the sustenance of time through its threads," the voice intoned. But the cycle is not yet complete. Marcos staggered back, clutching the bag tightly. What cycle? What does that mean? He shouted into the void, his voice cracking under the weight of his confusion and fear. But the voice offered no answers. Instead, the sand began to swirl around him, forming a vortex that lifted him off the ground. The vortex spat him out into a new scene. He landed hard on a cobblestone street, the sharp pain in his knees grounding him in reality. As he stood, he realized he was in a bustling marketplace. The air was alive with the scents of spices, roasted meats, and fresh bread. Vendors shouted in languages he didn't understand, their stalls overflowing with goods from eras both ancient and futuristic. He looked down at his phone instinctively, though he knew it wouldn't work. To his surprise, the screen flickered on, displaying a single message. Final delivery. Deliver the cycle. What cycle? He muttered, staring at the message as if it would provide clarity. But the phone went dark again, leaving him no closer to understanding. A figure in the crowd caught his attention. They were hooded, their face obscured, but their presence was commanding. They moved with purpose, weaving through the throng with ease. Marcos felt the now familiar pull again, this time stronger, more insistent. Without thinking, he followed. The hooded figure led him to the edge of the marketplace, where a small, nondescript building stood. Its walls were plain, its door unremarkable, but as Marcos approached, he felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. He had been here before, or somewhere like it. The pull in his chest became almost unbearable, urging him forward. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with shelves holding artifacts from every era imaginable. A knight's helmet sat beside a futuristic visor. A stone tablet shared space with a sleek, modern tablet computer. At the center of the room was a table, and on it sat a single, steaming pizza. The hooded figure stood behind the table, their hands resting lightly on its surface. Slowly, they removed their hood, revealing a face that made Marcos's blood run cold. It was his own. The two Marcuses stared at each other, the silence thick with unspoken questions. The hooded Marcos, the older Marcos, spoke first, his voice calm but heavy with something unnameable. "You've come far," he said. "Further than I did the first time." Marcos shook his head, taking a step back. "What is this? Who are you?" The older Marcos gestured to the pizza. "This is the cycle. The deliveries, the jumps through time. The places you've seen, they're all part of it. We've been chosen to carry it forward, to maintain the balance." "Balance?" Marcos repeated, his voice rising. "This isn't balance. This is chaos. None of this makes sense." The older Marcos smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. It never does at first, but the cycle isn't meant to be understood. It's meant to be fulfilled. The younger Marcos clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. "What happens if I refuse? What if I walk away right now?" The older Marcos's expression darkened. "You can't. The cycle binds us. If you try to run, it will bring you back. And each time, it will be harder, more fragmented, until there's nothing left of you." Marcos looked at the pizza on the table, its simplicity mocking him. "And what happens if I complete it?" The older Marcos met his gaze, unflinching. "Then you become me." Marcos's heart pounded as he stood across from his older self. The pizza on the table between them seemed almost absurd in its ordinariness, its simplicity a cruel joke amidst the chaos of time and space. The older Marcos watched him with a calmness that felt unnatural, his face lined with the weight of truths yet to be revealed. "Why?" the younger Marcos finally asked, his voice trembling. "Why does it have to be me? Why can't someone else, anyone else, do this?" The older Marcos tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. It's not about why, he said softly. It's about how. The cycle chooses not based on reason, but on necessity. And once you're chosen, there's no escaping it. Marcos felt his knees weaken, his mind swirling with fragments of the impossible journey he'd endured. The ballroom, the medieval feast, the futuristic drones, the pirate ship, the endless desert, each moment had felt disconnected, chaotic. But now, standing here, he began to sense a pattern. The cycle wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was alive. The older Marcos gestured toward the pizza. You've seen it, haven't you? The threads connecting everything. Every delivery, every encounter. It's all part of the same web. The cycle sustains it, keeps the threads from unraveling. Without couriers like us, the fabric of time itself would collapse. Marcos clenched his fists, anger surging through him. And what about us? What do we get out of it? Just endless deliveries? Forever trapped in this loop? The older Marcos's gaze hardened. We get purpose. We get to hold the universe together, piece by fragile piece. And we get to know that, for all the chaos and madness, we made a difference. Marcos shook his head, stepping back from the table. That's not enough. It's not fair. It's never fair, the older Marcos said quietly. But fairness doesn't matter to the cycle. Only completion does. The room seemed to darken as the words hung in the air. The younger Marcos stared at the pizza, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Complete the delivery and become the figure before him, or resist and risk being consumed by the very cycle he sought to escape. Neither path felt like freedom. Why can't I just stop? He muttered, almost to himself. Because stopping isn't an option, the older Marcos replied. The cycle isn't something you can abandon. It's part of you now, as much as your heartbeat or your breath. Every step you've taken, every moment you've experienced, it's been leading you here. Marcos felt the pull again, that inexorable force tugging at him. It wasn't physical, but it was undeniable. The cycle wasn't just around him, it was inside him. With trembling hands, he reached for the pizza. The moment his fingers brushed the box, the room shuddered. The walls dissolved into streams of light, and the shelves of artifacts melted away into the void. Marcos closed his eyes as the sensation of falling consumed him once more. When he opened them, he was standing at the door of a small, unassuming house. The rain poured down, soaking him instantly, but he barely noticed. In his hands was the delivery bag, the pizza still warm inside. A number was etched onto the door, 107 Sunset Avenue. Marcos's breath caught. He had been here before, at the beginning of his journey, but this time, the house looked different. The lights inside were on, casting a warm glow through the windows. He hesitated, his heart pounding, before stepping forward and knocking on the door. The door creaked open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the light. It was an older woman, her face lined with age but kind. She looked at the delivery bag, then at Marcos and smiled. "You made it," she said softly, as if she had been expecting him. Marcos handed her the pizza without a word, his mind racing. The moment the bag left his hands, he felt a strange release, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. The woman nodded, her smile growing wider. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Before Marcos could respond, the door closed. He stood there for a moment, the rain washing over him, before turning to leave. As he walked back toward his motorbike, he realized something. The app on his phone was still buzzing, but this time, the notification was different. Cycle complete. The rain began to ease, and the clouds overhead parted, revealing a sky filled with stars. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Marcos felt free. The cycle was complete, but what came next was a mystery. He didn't know where the road would take him, but for now, that was enough. And somewhere, In the infinite threads of time, the cycle prepared to choose its next career. The corporate hourglass. The Grand Convention Hall in Cairo was buzzing with voices, a symphony of conversations layered atop the faint hum of air conditioning. Rows of booths showcased the latest innovations in travel technology, each gleaming under artificial lights. Booking.com's banner hung prominently over its exhibition space, boasting slogans about seamless journeys and global connections. Alan Navarro adjusted his tie as he approached the booth, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. As a senior executive, Alan was no stranger to these events. Deals were struck, alliances formed, and innovations paraded like trophies. But this year felt different. Maybe it was the jet lag, or perhaps it was the inexplicable heaviness in the air, but something gnawed at him, a sense of unease he couldn't shake. The source of his unease came into view, a small, unassuming booth tucked into the far corner of the hall. It lacked the flashy screens and holographic displays of its neighbors, but it radiated an aura of mystery. Above it, a modest sign read, "Relics of Time." Artifacts of ancient Egypt. Alan wasn't sure what drew him to it. Perhaps it was the contrast between the booth's simplicity and the technological extravaganza around it. Or maybe it was the faint glimmer of the object resting on a velvet pedestal at its center. A delicate hourglass with sand that seemed to shimmer unnaturally, shifting colors with each movement. The vendor, an elderly man with a weathered face, greeted Alan with a knowing smile. "You have a discerning eye," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "This hourglass is no ordinary artifact." Alan chuckled, his corporate skepticism kicking in. "Let me guess, cursed by the pharaohs? Or does it grant wishes if I flip it 3 times? The man's smile didn't falter. "It doesn't grant wishes," he said, "but it does grant time. If you know how to use it." Alan's interest peaked despite himself. He leaned closer, inspecting the intricate carvings on the hourglass's frame, hieroglyphs and symbols that seemed to move when viewed from different angles. The sand inside flowed steadily, yet oddly, as if each grain were deciding its own path. "How much?" Alan asked, half joking, expecting an exorbitant price. "Not for sale," the man replied, his tone firm. "But it is yours if you're willing to carry its burden." Alan frowned, his corporate instincts wary. But something about the hourglass called to him, a magnetic pull he couldn't resist. Before he could think twice, he nodded. The man handed it to him, his hands lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "Use it wisely," he murmured. Later that evening, back in his hotel room, Alan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the hourglass. Its glow seemed more pronounced in the dim light, casting intricate patterns on the walls. He turned it over absent-mindedly, watching the sand begin to flow. The effect was immediate. The world around him froze. The air hung heavy, motionless. The faint sounds of the bustling city outside ceased entirely. Alan stood, his heart racing, and looked out the window. Cars were frozen mid-motion, pedestrians caught in mid-step. Time itself had stopped. Alan's mind raced with possibilities. This was beyond anything he had ever experienced, beyond logic, beyond science. He turned the hourglass upright, and the world resumed with a jolt, as if nothing had happened. Over the next few days, Alan experimented with the hourglass, testing its limits. He discovered that each flip stopped time for exactly 3 minutes. During those minutes, he was free to move, to act, to explore, while the world remained frozen. He used it to navigate crowded meetings, to catch flights he'd almost missed, even to avoid confrontations with difficult clients. The power it granted him was intoxicating. But it wasn't long before the hourglass revealed its true nature. One evening, as Alan prepared for bed, he noticed something strange. The hourglass, which had always been warm to the touch, now felt cold, lifeless. He turned it over again, curious, but this time the sand flowed upward. The room around him dissolved, replaced by an all-too-familiar scene. His first day at Booking.com. He was standing in the lobby, younger and less polished, clutching a briefcase and nervously adjusting his tie. He remembered this moment vividly. It was the start of his career, the beginning of everything. But why was he here now? Alan watched as his younger self approached the elevator, fumbling with his ID badge. The scene unfolded exactly as he remembered, down to the embarrassing moment when he dropped his papers and scrambled to pick them up. But then something changed. A man stepped into the frame, someone Alan didn't recognize. He handed young Alan a paper Alan had no recollection of ever seeing. The older Alan tried to intervene, to call out, but his voice didn't carry. He was a ghost, an observer. The man whispered something to his younger self, and the scene faded, leaving Alan alone in the void. He awoke in his hotel room, the hourglass glowing faintly on the nightstand. His chest heaved as he struggled to process what had just happened. Was it a vision? A memory? Or something else entirely? He picked up the hourglass, examining it closely. The symbols seemed more vivid now, the sand flowing slightly faster. Alan realized the hourglass was more than a tool. It was a doorway. It wasn't just stopping time, it was rewriting it. The weight of the hourglass felt heavier in Alan's hand now, its surface colder than before. The scene he had witnessed, his first day at Booking.com, played on a loop in his mind. It wasn't just a memory, it was altered. The man who had handed young Alan that paper wasn't part of his original experience. Alan was certain of it. The hourglass wasn't just allowing him to pause time. It was interfering with his past. Alan placed the hourglass back on the nightstand, pacing his hotel room as his thoughts spiraled. What had the man whispered to his younger self? What was written on that paper? He searched his memories, but they felt incomplete, as though something vital had been erased. His mind screamed for answers, but there was only one way to find them. He flipped the hourglass again. This time, the sensation was different. He wasn't falling into a memory. Instead, he was thrust forward. The air became thin, sharp, and cold. When Alan opened his eyes, he was standing in a cavernous office that was simultaneously unfamiliar and eerily recognizable. The walls were lined with sleek, futuristic panels that displayed streams of data in languages and symbols he couldn't decipher. The windows offered a view of a sprawling cityscape, its skyline dominated by towering spires and shimmering lights. The Booking.com logo was there, emblazoned on a massive holographic display, but it was different. The familiar blue and white branding had been replaced by something colder, more sterile. Beneath the logo were the words, "No borders, no time, only destinations." Alan's breath caught in his throat as he realized where he was, or rather, when. This was the future. A future where his company had grown beyond recognition. He approached the nearest console, its interface responding to his touch. Streams of information flashed before him. Global markets conquered, timelines optimized, entire civilizations cataloged and monetized. Booking.com had transcended travel. It had become the architect of time itself. "Fascinating, isn't it?" a voice said behind him. Alan spun around, his heart pounding. The man from his vision, the one who had handed his younger self that paper, stood before him. He looked older now, his sharp suit blending seamlessly with the ultramodern surroundings. His presence exuded authority, and his eyes held a glint of knowing amusement. "You're him," Alan stammered. "The man from my first day." The stranger smiled. "I prefer to think of myself as your guide. Call me what you will." He gestured toward the holographic displays. "This is what your company becomes. What you helped build." Alan shook his head, stepping back. "This isn't possible. I never." "Did you really think your success was entirely your own doing?" The man interrupted. "The hourglass chose you because you were capable, yes, but also because you were pliable. Your decisions, your innovations, they were nudged, guided. Every pivotal moment in your career was orchestrated." The weight of the words crashed over Alan like a tidal wave. His accomplishments, his rise to the top, none of it was truly his. "Why?" he demanded. "Why me? Why any of this?" The man's expression darkened. "Because time is a commodity, Alan. One that can be shaped, controlled, sold. And you, whether you realized it or not, have been the perfect agent of that control." Alan's mind reeled as the implications sank in. His success, his influence, had been used to build this monstrosity of corporate domination. "I didn't choose this," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "But you did," the man replied calmly. "Every decision you made brought you here. Every flip of that hourglass pulled you further into the web. And now, you stand at the precipice. The question is, what will you do next?" Before Alan could respond, the room dissolved into darkness. He was falling again, tumbling through a void that felt colder, harsher than before. When he landed, the air was hot and dry, and the faint smell of decay filled his nostrils. He was in a desert, but not the shimmering expanse he had seen earlier. This was barren, lifeless, and endless. The remains of structures jutted out from the sand. Crumbling towers, shattered vehicles, the remnants of a once thriving civilization. Alan's heart sank as he realized what he was seeing. The ruins of the future he had just visited. The hourglass, glowing faintly in his hand, seemed to pulse with each step he took. He approached one of the broken towers, its base half buried in the sand. The Booking.com logo was etched into the surface, weathered but still recognizable. Beneath it, the words had changed, "Destinations lost." A wave of despair washed over him. Was this the endgame? Was this what all his choices had led to? A world consumed by greed and exploitation, left to rot in the sands of time? Alan sank to his knees, clutching the hourglass tightly. The symbols on its frame seemed to shift and writhe, almost as if mocking him. He had thought he was in control, but the truth was clear now. The hourglass had been using him from the start, and yet, he wasn't ready to give up. If the hourglass had the power to bring him here, then maybe, just maybe, it had the power to change things, to undo the damage, to rewrite the story. With trembling hands, Alan flipped the hourglass once more. The world around Alan trembled as the hourglass flipped in his hands, the sand flowing upward once more. He clenched it tightly, his mind a swirl of desperation and determination. The barren desert dissolved, replaced by a landscape that felt suspended between past, present, and future. Towers of glass and steel rose beside crumbling ruins, while cobblestone streets twisted and merged into highways teeming with vehicles that hovered silently above the ground. It was as though every timeline he had touched had converged into a single, chaotic tapestry. The air shimmered with energy, crackling faintly, as if time itself were on the brink of collapse. Alan stood in the center of it all, the hourglass glowing brightly in his hand. The pull he'd felt so many times before was now stronger, more insistent, dragging him toward a massive structure at the heart of the temporal chaos. The building was monolithic, its surface polished like a mirror, reflecting not just Alan's image but fragmented scenes of his life. He saw himself as a young executive, nervously delivering his first pitch. He saw the milestones of his career, the promotions, the accolades, all tinged with the shadow of the hourglass's influence. And beyond that, He saw flashes of futures that might have been. A life without the hourglass, a simpler existence untouched by its manipulations. As Alan approached the structure, a figure emerged from its gleaming entrance. It was the man from his vision, his guide, as he had called himself, dressed in the same sharp suit, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You're persistent," the man said, his voice calm but edged with something darker. Most would have surrendered by now. Alan stopped a few steps away, his grip tightening on the hourglass. "I'm not here to play your game," he said. "I'm here to end it." The man raised an eyebrow, his faint smirk betraying amusement. "End it? Do you even know what it is, Alan? The hourglass isn't just a tool or a trinket. It's the anchor of time itself. Without it, the threads unravel. The cycle collapses. And you're part of that cycle." Alan's chest tightened. "Then tell me how to break it. How to stop this madness." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of weary resolve. "Breaking the cycle means breaking yourself. The hourglass is bound to you, Alan. To undo its influence, you must undo your place within the timeline." The weight of the words hit Alan like a blow. "Undo my place?" he repeated, his voice trembling. "You're saying I'd have to erase myself?" The man nodded. "Erase, rewrite, call it what you will. But yes, to sever the hourglass's grip on time, you must remove the anchor it's latched onto. And that anchor is you." Alan's thoughts raced. Every instinct screamed at him to reject the idea, to cling to his existence, no matter how flawed it might be. But the images flashing on the structure's mirrored surface reminded him of what was at stake. The ruined future, the endless exploitation, the cycles of manipulation. If breaking the cycle meant sacrificing himself, wasn't it worth it? "I can't just erase everything," Alan said, his voice a mix of defiance and despair. "There has to be another way." The man stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You've seen the threads, Alan. You know how fragile they are. Every choice you've made, every flip of that hourglass, has pulled at them, stretched them. The more you use it, the closer they come to snapping. There's no other way to mend them." Alan turned the hourglass over in his hands, staring at the shimmering sand as it flowed in its impossible dance. For the first time, he noticed something he hadn't before. The grains weren't uniform. Each one seemed to contain a fragment of a memory, a moment frozen in time. He saw his younger self laughing with colleagues, the faces of clients he had helped, and even the ruins of the future he had witnessed. Every grain was a piece of the tapestry, tied to him inextricably. A deep sadness welled up inside him. He thought of the life he had built, the career he had fought so hard for. But he also thought of the damage the hourglass had caused, the lives it had altered without consent. Could he carry that burden any longer? The man watched him silently, his expression unreadable. "The choice is yours, Alan," he said finally. "But remember, doing nothing is also a choice, and the threads will only stretch so far." Alan took a deep breath, his mind settling into a strange clarity. He stepped past the man, toward the entrance of the monolithic structure. Inside, the walls pulsed with energy, glowing in time with the rhythm of his heartbeat. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, identical to the one on which he had first seen the hourglass in Cairo. He placed the hourglass on the pedestal, its glow intensifying as it connected with the structure. The room vibrated, the air thick with energy. Alan turned back to the man, who stood in the doorway, watching him with a mix of curiosity and resignation. "If this is the only way," Alan said, his voice steady, "then I'll do it." The man nodded. "Then flip it one last time." Alan reached for the hourglass, his hand trembling. The symbols on its frame glowed brightly, their patterns shifting as though aware of his intent. He turned it over, the sand flowing upward in a final, defiant cascade. The effect was immediate. The structure dissolved into light, and Alan felt himself unraveling with it. Memories flashed before him in rapid succession. His childhood, his first day at Booking.com, the moment he picked up the hourglass. Each fragment faded, slipping away like sand through his fingers. And then, nothing. Alan floated in a vast, featureless void, a space devoid of light, sound, or sensation. He was no longer certain of his form. His hands, his body, even his thoughts seemed to fragment and disperse like grains of sand carried on an unseen wind. It was neither pain nor peace. It was simply absence. And then, faintly at first, a glimmer of light appeared. It expanded, drawing him toward it like a moth to a flame. As the light grew brighter, Alan felt himself coalescing, his fragmented self knitting back together. The void dissolved, replaced by the unmistakable buzz of a busy office. The smell of fresh coffee and the faint hum of air conditioning filled the air. He opened his eyes and found himself sitting at a desk. The desk was cluttered with papers and a laptop, its screen displaying an email with the subject line, "Welcome to Booking.com, First Day Checklist." Alan blinked, his heart racing as he recognized the scene. He was back at the beginning, his first day at the company, but something was different. The memories of his journey, the hourglass, the man in the suit, they were all there, lingering at the edges of his mind like a half-remembered dream. His phone buzzed, drawing his attention. The screen displayed a notification, "Meeting with HR at 10 a.m." Alan checked the time, 9:45. He remembered this moment vividly. It was the day he had dropped his papers in the lobby, the day he had met the man who handed him that mysterious document. But this time, there was no sense of inevitability, no unseen force pulling at him. The choice was his. Alan stood, smoothing his tie as he walked toward the elevator. The lobby was just as he remembered it, bustling with new hires and employees rushing to their destinations. He clutched his papers tightly, determined not to let history repeat itself. As he waited for the elevator, he noticed someone standing nearby, a young man, nervous and out of place, fumbling with his own stack of documents. The elevator doors opened, and Alan stepped aside, gesturing for the man to go first. The stranger offered a grateful smile, and for a fleeting moment, Alan saw himself in the young man's nervous expression. The elevator doors closed, and Alan stood alone, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. The day unfolded smoothly, uneventfully. Alan went through his onboarding, met his team, and began his first assignments. But as the hours passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The hourglass, the journey, the choice he had made. Had it all been for nothing? Had his sacrifice simply reset the cycle, trapping him in an endless loop? As the sun set outside the office window, Alan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime. His laptop screen displayed a new email, marked with an unfamiliar sender, timekeeper@cycleend.org. Alan hesitated before opening it. The email contained only a single sentence. "The threads are whole, and the cycle is yours no more." A wave of relief washed over him. The hourglass was gone. The cycle was broken. And yet, he still felt its echoes, the faint remnants of a path he had chosen to leave behind. Alan stood and looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was free, not just from the hourglass, but from the unseen forces that had guided his life. He didn't know what the future held. Perhaps the threads of time would weave themselves anew, forming patterns he could never predict. But for now, Alan was content to let the world turn without his interference. The cycle had ended, and a new story was just beginning. infinite vending machine. The flickering fluorescent lights in the convenience store hummed like a tired symphony. Martín Morales stood behind the counter, staring blankly at the clock on the wall. It was 11:47 p.m., the graveyard shift dragging on as usual. Outside, the streets of his small town were silent, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single street lamp. He glanced over at the vending machine in the corner of the store, an old Coca-Cola branded relic that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Its red paint was faded, the buttons sticky from years of neglect. Martín had never seen anyone use it. Most customers preferred the brightly lit refrigerators along the back wall. Yet tonight, something about the machine felt different. The faint hum it usually emitted seemed louder, more rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Martín shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was probably just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But then it happened. A low chime echoed from the machine, startling Martín from his stupor. He turned toward it, his brow furrowing. The vending machine's lights, usually dim and uneven, now glowed with an intensity that bathed the corner of the store in a strange, pulsating red hue. He approached cautiously, his sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. The machine's display flickered, showing an unfamiliar message, "Insert coin." Below it, the selection buttons began to flash in an erratic sequence, their once faded labels now glowing brightly. Martín hesitated, his curiosity warring with unease. He hadn't touched a coin in years. Everything was digital now, but a part of him felt compelled to search his pockets. To his surprise, his fingers brushed against a cold, metallic disc. He pulled it out, frowning. It was an old coin, larger and heavier than modern currency, with strange markings etched into its surface. The edges were worn, but the design, a series of concentric circles surrounding an eye, was unmistakable. Where did this come from? Martín muttered under his breath. Before he could second-guess himself, he slid the coin into the slot. The machine whirred to life, its gears grinding like the inner workings of an ancient clock. The display flickered again, this time showing a list of options Martín had never seen before. Ancient tonic, future energy, temporal blend. The titles pulsed on the screen, each one more cryptic than the last. Martín's finger hovered over the buttons, his heart pounding. He didn't know why, but he pressed 2. Future energy. The machine groaned, its inner mechanisms clanking like rusty cogs. A can dropped into the slot below, landing with an echo that seemed to reverberate far longer than it should have. Martín reached down and pulled out the item. A sleek silver can, cold to the touch, with no branding save for the word evolve written in bold, futuristic script. He turned it over in his hands, noticing how the surface seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the can wasn't entirely solid. Against his better judgment, he cracked it open. A faint hiss escaped, and a scent wafted up, sharp, metallic, yet oddly enticing. Before he could stop himself, Martín took a sip. The world tilted. It wasn't a feeling of dizziness but of movement. Forward, backward, sideways, all at once. The store around him blurred, its shelves and walls stretching and folding like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Martín dropped the can, but instead of hitting the floor, it hovered mid-air, spinning slowly as if caught in a gravity-less void. Then, with a jolt, everything snapped back into focus. The store was gone. Martín found himself standing on a street he didn't recognize, surrounded by buildings that towered impossibly high, their exteriors shimmering with holographic advertisements. The air buzzed with the hum of drones zipping overhead, their sleek forms casting fleeting shadows on the ground below. Pedestrians moved around him, their outfits glowing faintly with embedded lights, their faces obscured by translucent visors. Martín blinked, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't his town. This wasn't even his time. As he stumbled forward, trying to make sense of his surroundings, a low chime rang out, stopping him in his tracks. He turned to see another vending machine, identical to the one in his store, embedded in the side of a building. Its lights pulsed in the same rhythmic pattern, and the display read, "Insert coin." Martin felt his pocket instinctively. The strange coin was there again, as if it had never left. His hand trembled as he withdrew it, staring at the cryptic markings that seemed to glow faintly in the neon light of the city. He approached the machine cautiously, his mind racing. Was this the way back? Or would it take him somewhere even stranger? The city around him pulsed with life, a cacophony of sights and sounds that felt alien and overwhelming. But the vending machine stood silent, waiting, a beacon in the chaos. Martin inserted the coin. The machine's display flickered, and the options appeared again. Ancient tonic, future energy, temporal blend. This time, Martin hesitated. The last choice had taken him here, to this disorienting future. What would happen if he chose differently? His finger hovered over the buttons, sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, he pressed one. Ancient tonic. The machine groaned, and a bottle dropped into the slot below. It was old, impossibly old, its glass thick and uneven, with a cork stopper held in place by twine. The label was faded but legible. Elixir of eternity, one sip to see the past. Martin stared at the bottle, his pulse racing. Was this the answer he'd been searching for? A way to understand the machine's purpose, or perhaps his own? He uncorked the bottle, the scent of aged herbs and earth filling the air, and raised it to his lips. The world tilted once more. The liquid from the ancient tonic was thicker than Martin expected, with a taste that was earthy, bitter, and oddly metallic. As soon as it hit his tongue, the world around him began to dissolve. The futuristic city warped and bent, its towering buildings crumbling into fragments of light. The hum of drones, the neon advertisements, the glowing outfits, all faded into silence. When the world reformed, Martin found himself standing in a bustling marketplace. The air was thick with the scents of spices and roasted meat, the chatter of merchants and buyers filling the air. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the sight of stone buildings, vibrant fabric canopies, and carts piled high with goods. This wasn't just any market. It was ancient, perhaps Egyptian, judging by the architecture and the hieroglyphs carved into the walls of a nearby temple. Martin's modern sneakers looked absurdly out of place on the dusty cobblestones. He clutched the empty bottle, its glass now dull and lifeless, and scanned the marketplace for any sign of the vending machine. People bustled past him, their faces alive with activity, but completely unaware of the anomaly he had brought into their midst. Then he saw it, a familiar red box standing at the edge of the square, partially hidden behind a stack of clay pots. The vending machine looked as out of place as Martin felt. Its Coca-Cola logo was pristine, its lights glowing faintly in the desert sun. He approached it cautiously, the strange coin already in his hand. The machine's display lit up as he drew near, the now familiar insert coin message flashing insistently. Martin hesitated. Each choice he had made so far had thrown him deeper into this bizarre, fragmented journey. But what choice did he have? He inserted the coin. The machine whirred to life, its display flickering as the options appeared once more. Ancient tonic, future energy, temporal blend. Martin's finger hovered over the buttons. The ancient tonic had brought him here, but the journey felt incomplete. Maybe the other options held answers, or perhaps even a way home. He pressed 3. Temporal blend. The machine groaned as it dispensed a sleek bottle, its surface shimmering with a kaleidoscope of colors. The label read, "A sip of every moment, past, present, and future." Martin hesitated, his pulse quickening. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, but he was in too deep to turn back now. He uncapped the bottle and took a cautious sip. The liquid was cool, almost freezing, and carried a faint sweetness that masked an undercurrent of bitterness. As soon as it hit his throat, Martine felt a jolt, sharp, electric, and all-consuming. The marketplace vanished in an instant. Martine was falling again, tumbling through a void of swirling light and fragmented images. Moments flashed before his eyes. His first day at the convenience store, his childhood home, the futuristic city he had just left. But there was more. He saw places and times he had never visited. A battle fought with swords and shields, a classroom filled with students in glowing uniforms, a sprawling forest untouched by humanity. When the falling stopped, Martine found himself in the convenience store. For a moment, he thought it was over, that he had finally returned to where he started. But the store was wrong. The shelves were empty, the walls covered in graffiti he couldn't read. The vending machine stood in its usual corner, but its once bright lights were dim, its surface scratched and dented. A sense of unease settled over Martine. This wasn't his present. It was some version of it, one that had been abandoned, forgotten. The vending machine chimed softly, pulling Martine's attention. The display flickered, showing a single message, final selection. Beneath it, 3 new options appeared. Return to origin. Embrace the future. Break the cycle. Martine stared at the options, his mind racing. Return to origin. Was that his home, his time? Or just another version of it? Embrace the future. Did it mean staying in that strange, technological city? And break the cycle. What did that even mean? His hand hovered over the buttons. He thought of everything he had seen, the moments and places he had touched. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite assemble. He took a deep breath and pressed 3. Break the cycle. The machine groaned louder than ever, its lights flashing wildly. A noise like shattering glass filled the air as the vending machine seemed to implode, folding in on itself until it vanished completely. Martine staggered back, his ears ringing, as the convenience store around him began to warp and twist. The walls melted into streams of light, the shelves collapsing into nothingness. Martine closed his eyes, bracing for the now familiar sensation of falling, but it didn't come. Instead, he felt stillness. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in a vast, empty expanse. The ground beneath him was smooth and reflective, like a sheet of glass stretching infinitely in every direction. Above him, the sky shimmered with shifting colors, a kaleidoscope of possibilities. In the center of the expanse stood a single figure, shrouded in shadows. They turned to face him, and Martine felt a chill run down his spine. The figure stepped closer, their features coming into focus. Martine's breath caught as he realized he was looking at himself. Martine stood frozen, staring at the figure before him. It was him, but not him. This version of himself looked older, weathered, as if he had spent years wandering through time. His clothes were tattered and mismatched, fragments of different eras sewn together into a surreal patchwork. The older Martine's eyes carried a weight that felt unbearable, a gaze that seemed to pierce through the layers of reality itself. "You made the choice," the older Martine said, his voice low and resonant. "You broke the cycle." Martine took a step back, his heart pounding. What does that mean? What cycle? What's happening to me? The older Martine tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. The cycle was never about the machine. It was about you. Every moment you've experienced, every decision you've made. It's all been leading to this. Martine shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. That doesn't make any sense. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to finish my shift, to get back to my life. The older Martine's lips curled into a faint, bittersweet smile. Your life? Look around you. Does this feel like the life you knew? The expanse shifted as he spoke. Scenes began to emerge on the reflective ground beneath them, fragments of Martine's journey. The bustling marketplace, the futuristic city, the abandoned convenience store. Even moments from his own life before the vending machine. He saw himself as a child, running through a park, as a teenager, laughing with friends, as the young adult who had taken the graveyard shift because he needed the extra cash. You think your life was simple, the older Martine continued, stepping closer. But it was always intertwined with something greater. The vending machine was just a doorway, a tool to show you the threads you've been pulling on without realizing. Martine stared at the scenes, his mind racing. The memories felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Why me? He whispered. Why was I the one who had to do this? Because the machine chose you, the older Martine replied. Or maybe you chose it. Does it matter? What matters is that you've reached the end of the journey. The older Martine extended a hand, and Martine hesitated before taking it. The moment their fingers touched, a rush of energy surged through him. The expanse around them exploded into color, a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Martine saw the vending machine appear again, its familiar red surface glowing faintly in the chaos. This is your final chance, the older Martine said, his voice steady. The machine is gone, but its power lingers. You can return to the life you knew, or you can embrace what you've become. Martine looked at the vending machine, his heart pounding. And what have I become? The older Martine's expression softened, a thread in the fabric of time, a weaver of moments, someone who can shape the past, present, and future, but only if you're willing to let go of who you were. Martine's mind reeled. The thought of returning to his old life was tempting, but the journey had changed him. He had seen too much, experienced too many impossible things. The vending machine wasn't just an object. It was a key to something far greater, and now he held that power within himself. What happens if I let go? Martine asked. The older Martine's gaze was unwavering. You become part of the flow, no longer bound by a single timeline, but connected to all of them. You'll exist everywhere and nowhere, a guardian of the threads. And if I go back? Martine's voice cracked. What then? You'll forget, the older Martine said simply. The memories, the journeys, the choices, they'll fade. You'll return to the life you knew, none the wiser. The vending machine shimmered, its lights flickering as if waiting for his decision. Martine felt the pull of both options, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The thought of forgetting everything was comforting in its simplicity, but also terrifying. To lose the knowledge of what he had seen, the understanding of his place in the greater tapestry. It felt like a loss he couldn't bear. But to embrace the flow, to become part of something infinite, it was a leap into the unknown, a step he wasn't sure he was ready to take. I don't know if I can do this, Martine whispered. You already have. The older Martine replied. The question isn't if you can, it's if you will. Martine closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The swirling vortex around him seemed to still, the chaotic colors fading into a calm, radiant light. When he opened his eyes, the vending machine was gone. The older Martine stood before him, his expression serene. I'm ready, Martine said, his voice steady. I don't know what's ahead, but I'm ready. The older Martine smiled, a genuine, warm smile that seemed to lighten the weight of the moment. Then it's time. He placed his hand on Martine's shoulder, and the light around them intensified, enveloping everything in a blinding glow. For a moment, Martine felt weightless, free, as if he were dissolving into the very fabric of the universe. The light consumed everything, washing away the swirling chaos and fractured images until Martin felt himself suspended in perfect stillness. There was no ground beneath him, no sky above, just an endless expanse of white. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he wasn't falling, running, or grasping for answers. He simply existed. And yet, within that stillness, Martin sensed movement, not outside, but within himself. The threads of time he had touched on his journey began to weave together, their patterns intricate and alive. He saw flashes of moments he'd barely understood before. The ancient marketplace, the towering city of the future, the abandoned convenience store. Each one connected to the other, forming a tapestry that shimmered with possibility. The older Martin's voice echoed softly through the stillness. This is where it begins and ends. You've seen the threads. Now you must decide what to weave. Martin looked at his hands and saw the threads flowing through his fingers, golden, silver, and crimson strands, each one pulsing faintly. The patterns they formed were incomplete, waiting for his touch. He didn't need to be told what to do. He simply knew. The knowledge was as instinctive as breathing. He reached out, his hands moving in deliberate motions. Each thread he touched responded, shifting and blending with the others. The marketplace reappeared, but now it was vibrant, alive, its energy radiating outward into other times. The futuristic city returned, its towering structures gleaming with promise rather than dominance. Even the convenience store emerged, humble yet whole, its flickering lights steady once more. Martin wove himself into the tapestry, his presence neither overwhelming nor diminished. He was a thread among threads, a part of something far greater than himself. As he worked, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, the weight of his choices lifting as the tapestry grew. The light around him began to fade, replaced by a gentle warmth. Martin opened his eyes to find himself standing in the convenience store. The hum of the fluorescent lights was back, comforting in its mundanity. Shelves were stocked neatly, the vending machine glowing softly in the corner. It looked like any ordinary night shift, except Martin knew it wasn't. The vending machine chimed softly, its display reading, "Cycle complete." "Thank you." The words lingered for a moment before fading, and the machine powered down. Martin approached it, placing a hand on its surface. It was cold, inert, just a machine once more. He stepped back, his heart steady, his mind calm. The journey had changed him, but he wasn't weighed down by it anymore. The threads of time were whole, their flow undisturbed. And though he had become a part of that flow, he also felt grounded in the present, the moment he now called his own. As the hours of his shift ticked by, Martin felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. Customers came and went, oblivious to the extraordinary journey their cashier had taken. To them, he was just another worker, another face in the background of their lives. But Martin didn't mind. He understood now that the beauty of time lay not in its grandeur but in its details, the mundane, the fleeting, the ordinary. When his shift ended, Martin stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against his face. He looked up at the stars, their light steady and ancient. For the first time in his life, he felt at peace, not because he had all the answers, but because he knew he didn't need them. And somewhere, in the infinite threads of time, the machine waited patiently, its cycle ready to begin again.